Well, hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Dan Levin, and this is Essential Questions. In the 19th century, the world began to see a rise in the nationalist spirit and the modernization of nation-states. As nations like Germany, Italy, France, and Spain began to realize their national identities, Jews who were scattered across Europe began to reconsider their own national identity. The Jewish people have always known themselves to be a people, a nation. Just look at old Russian identity cards, and under nationality, our people were not identified as Russian, but as Jews. And as life in Europe grew ever more precarious, with pogroms raging through vulnerable cities and shtetls, Jews began to hear a call to begin to make their way home. There were those who insisted that Jews were part of the fabric of the Western nations where they lived: France, Austria, Germany, the United States. Their national identities were intrinsically tied to the lands and states in which they lived. One of those Jews was Theodor Herzl, who grew up in an assimilated Jewish family in the Jewish quarter of Budapest. After studying law in Vienna, Herzl became a journalist, serving as a foreign correspondent for the New Free Press. He was tasked with covering the trial of French captain Alfred Dreyfus, who was also a fully assimilated Jew and had risen in the ranks of the French army. He was framed for treason, and in his trial in Paris, there was an international fascination. Standing outside the courthouse, Herzl heard the crowds chanting, "Death to the Jews! Death to the Jews!" and it shook him to his core. And when Dreyfus was convicted in what was widely viewed as an anti-Semitic miscarriage of justice, Herzl came to understand an epiphany: that Jews needed to organize to realize their own national aspirations and restore the sovereignty that had been robbed of the Jews millennia before. And thus he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in late August of 1897. 200 people from 17 countries, 69 of whom were delegates from various Zionist societies, and the remainder individuals who had been invited to come together, developed a political movement to restore Jewish sovereignty to their homeland. It wasn't just about establishing a physical home for the Jewish people. It was also about establishing a place in which the moral and spiritual vision of Judaism could be fully realized. The philosopher Martin Buber taught that the land of Zion was not simply a piece of property promised to the Jewish people. It was, he wrote, always at the same time a challenge to make of it what God intended to have made of it, a holy land. And later, in May of 1948, when Israel wrote its Declaration of Independence, the vision of the State of Israel advanced a moral ideal. The State of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. There perhaps could not be a more progressive vision for the birth of a new state. And ironically, over the years, there was this understanding of Israel as this struggling new democracy in a sea of authoritarian and despotic regimes. But more recently, it's become difficult for Jews to find their way in progressive spaces. And in fact, you have heard in many different places the word Zionist used as a disparaging way of impugning the integrity of those who might subscribe to progressive causes, or to the causes that have always been at the root of what the moral vision of Judaism has always been. This began in the Zionism is racism resolution that we saw in the United Nations and continues to today. It has become even more acute in the period since the attacks of October the 7th. And to help us understand how we can better understand how we can merge or integrate a progressive vision of life with Zionism, we have no one better to help us in this conversation than Amanda Berman, who is the founder and executive director of the Zionist movement, where she works to empower and activate Zionists on the progressive left to stand proudly in social justice spaces as Jews and Zionists. She is also a civil rights attorney who previously worked to fight anti-Semitism in the legal sphere, spearheading such groundbreaking initiatives as the International Action Against Kuwait Airways for its discrimination against Israeli nationals, and the dual cases against San Francisco State University for its constitutional and civil rights violations against Jewish and Israeli students and members of their community. She writes on Jewish and civil rights issues and is a recipient of Hadassah's prestigious Myrtle Wreath Award. She was listed by the Allgemeiner as one of the top 100 people positively contributing to Jewish life. She graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a bachelor's in diplomatic history and a master's of governmental administration, and received her law degree from Cardozo School of Law, where she was a public service scholar. Amanda, so great to have you with us today. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So tell us a little bit about your upbringing. I know you come from the Philadelphia area. And how did you kind of grow to gather the core beliefs about who you are as an American, as a Jew, as someone who holds progressive values? Where did all that come from?
You know, I get this question a lot, and I always say I don't have like a really exciting story of how I came to do this work in terms of this identity, in terms of holding this identity so proudly and confidently. I grew up outside Philadelphia on the main line in a strongly Jewish community. Many of my personal friends were Jewish and our family friends were Jewish. I went to a conservative synagogue, though we only went a couple of times a year. And after my bat mitzvah, I basically stopped going. And to me, that was a pretty normative Jewish experience, a suburban, Jewish upbringing where lots of my friends were Jewish, but not all of them, where I was in a public school that had a significant number of Jews, but, certainly still a minority, where we went to synagogue, when we had for Hebrew school and bat mitzvah, but not after that, for high holidays, but not Shabbat, generally speaking. And we never really talked about the word Zionism. And that's a thing I think about a lot growing up, that it was expected that as a Jew you were a Zionist, but you were never told what that even meant. You weren't, or where in my synagogue when I grew up, we knew we were connected to the people in Israel. We knew that Israel was connected to us. We knew that whenever we said prayers, we didn't understand any of the other words and any other prayers that we were taught other than the words Israel and Zion. We knew what those meant when we were, speaking in Hebrew, all these other words that we didn't understand. So we knew there was a connection. During high holiday services, we would plant trees. You would make a commitment to planting trees or to doing Israel bonds, to investing in Israel bonds. But that was really the extent of it for most of my life growing up. No one in my family had ever been to Israel. None of my parents and none of my grandparents had ever been to Israel. And if I'm being honest, I'm not actually sure that they regretted that. They, it wasn't a thing they thought about very frequently. But of course, they supported Israel. And it wasn't an issue until really when I was in law school, and it started to be a question of people making assumptions about quote unquote Zionists, and myself included in what I'm about to say. Most Jews didn't have a really strong response to the suggestion that there was something wrong with being a Zionist, because we hadn't been raised to really know what that word meant other than to know that it was part of what it meant to be Jewish. And so I really, and this is something that I hear so frequently from young people now, I really only started to think about and explore what it meant to be a Zionist when I was targeted as a Zionist and when I saw other people targeted as a Zionist. And I needed to decide, do I want to defend myself? Do I want to, subject myself to this? Do I want to fight back? Or do I want to say, no, I'm not a Zionist? And that's what I think so many young people, specifically in progressive spaces, are experiencing today. That question of like, do I want to fight back, or do I want to just say, no, I'm not a Zionist. I'll pass your test. I'll be a good Jew. I won't be a Zionist.
To you, what does it mean to be a Zionist? You talked about being targeted as a Zionist. What to you does it mean to be a Zionist? Is it somebody who supports willy-nilly whatever it is that the state of Israel chooses to be and do? Is it more nuanced than that? Is it just someone who is a pro-Israel advocate? What to you does it really mean to be a Zionist?
I talk about it at Zioness in two different ways. I talk about identity Zionism and I talk about modern political Zionism. And they are, of course, intrinsically connected, but they're not exactly the same thing. I talk about identity Zionism as being an understanding that the Jewish people are the children of Zion, born at Mount Zion, that on every prayer book, on every page, you see the word Zion, people of Zion, Mount Zion. That for thousands of years in the diaspora, in exile, the Jewish people all over the world, not connected to each other, speaking different languages, eating different foods, prayed in the direction of Zion, longing to return to Zion. That Zion is really the beating heart of Jewish peoplehood. It is the story of our history and our traditions and our faith and our homeland. And that, of course, is baked into all of our holidays and all of our practices. That Hebrew, is the language of the Jewish people, originally from Judea, that we revived that language once we returned to our indigenous place. So Zion is so deeply embedded in Jewish identity, Jewish practice, Jewish faith, Jewish peoplehood, the Jewish story. You can't pull it out. And there are people who try constantly to say Zionism has nothing to do with being Jewish. And frankly, for people who really know anything about Jewish history or Jewish practice, it is impossible to extricate Zion from Judaism. And so to me, or Jewish peoplehood and Jewish religion and Jewish peoplehood, not the same thing either. So connected, of course, but not the same thing. But Zion is intrinsic to both. So that to me is identity Zionism. You can't pull Zion out from my Jewish identity. And so I'm a Zionist because I'm a Jew. And as a Jew, I believe in the liberation of our people. As a Jew, I want collective liberation and freedom and safety and sovereignty for the Jewish nation, the Jewish people. In this conversation, I try to help people understand that the Jewish people are not a religious group. We have a religion, but we are a nation, a people with shared DNA, with shared history, with shared ancestry, with indigeneity to this place, to this land, the land of Israel. And so as a nation, in the late 1800s, you mentioned Theodore Herzl bringing together the Zionist Congress and saying it's time to reclaim sovereignty in our ancestral homeland. When that was happening, there were lots of nation states being formed. People don't often think about the fact that the Zionist movement rose at a time that lots of other nationalist movements were rising and at a time when empires were falling. And so for the Jewish nation to seek sovereignty at the same time that all of these other nation states were coming into being was totally normal, not strange, not weird, not oppressive, not colonialism, not any of the sort of buzzwords that we hear about it now. So I talk about Theodore Herzl launching that modern political Zionist movement based on that word Zionism that relates to our identity as Jews. But the modern political Zionist movement about establishing sovereignty was for the Jewish nation, not for the Jewish religion, but for the Jewish nation. And it's important to distinguish those things because so many times you'll hear people saying, I'm not a Zionist, that's a political position that I don't support. So I respond by saying, actually, Zionism really is not political. So when I talk about Herzl's modern political Zionist movement, I mean political in the sense of sovereignty, statehood, borders, not in the sense of left, right, conservative, liberal, progressive. It's not about, Likud versus labor. It's not about American politics. It's not about Israeli politics. And it's not about Israel's relationship to its neighbors either. Zionism is not political other than to the extent that sovereignty is a political endeavor, that's seeking to build a state with a government by and for the Jewish nation is political in that sense. Otherwise, not political at all.
If Zionism is simply this political movement, and again, the word political mean in the academic sense, perhaps not in the zeitgeist sense, the political movement to restore Jewish sovereignty to the land of Israel, what could be wrong with that? So when we think about the critique that people level against Zionism that you often hear, where is that coming from? What are the pejoratives that people are looking at that, in your experience, make them look askance at Zionism as opposed to this liberation movement that you would think everyone would embrace?
So there's a lot in this question, of course. I think, first of all, there's a lot of collapsing and conflating that happens when people use the word Zionism. There's a lot of ignorance, mostly ignorance, of people not understanding what the word Zionism is. And in the world we live in now, where most people are getting most of the information that they believe from social media, and they're hearing things that often are coming from foreign propaganda sources or coming from people who also are ignorant to the history or have never met a Jewish person, it's really easy to start to believe things that aren't true. And so there have been over many decades now, you mentioned the Zionism is Racism resolution at the UN. When I talk about this, this resolution that was introduced by the Soviet Union in 1975. It did pass at the UN. It was rescinded in shame in 1991. But the damage was done between 1975 and 1991. The international community really absorbed the idea, and the global left in particular really absorbed the idea that Zionism was racism.
What was it that made them say Zionism was racism? Was it because this was an establishment or the effort to establish a state for the Jews by the Jews and looking at the Jews through the lens of racism? Or was there something else going on in that?
Anyone who's really heard anything about Soviet propaganda knows that they are best in class. And so when they wanted to create a narrative and institutionalize a global narrative, it had to have some essence of truth, right? And that's how propaganda works. It builds off a lie, or it builds off a truth and becomes a big lie that once you try to boil it down, there's enough truth that people start to believe it. The Zionism is Racism resolution was Cold War propaganda. It really had almost nothing to do with Israel. This was at the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union wanted to target Western influence in the Middle East. And Israel was seen as the little Satan, as it is now, America being the big Satan and Israel being the little Satan. And so in order to target Western influence and capitalism in the Middle East, the Soviets decided to target Israel and to create a situation within the international community where Israel was unstable and insecure, and therefore it was destabilizing America's influence in the region. Understanding that history and understanding which states voted, and we have actually a whole resource on this on our website about the Zionism is Racism resolution and how that turned into the situation that we're in today. The resolution was also introduced at a time that the United Nations was ostensibly doing what it could to address racism and racial discrimination. And so there were conferences that UN hosted conferences. There was one in Durban, South Africa, to address racism and racial discrimination, where the Zionism is Racism conversation this is where it became so embedded in this race conversation. To your original question, the presupposition in the Zionism is Racism conversation, not the Soviet intention necessarily, but the way that it was received by a lot of people, certainly in the Western world, is that Jews are white. We are seen and perceived as white. Many Jews in America, the majority of Jews in America, look white and in some ways experience whiteness and in other ways don't. And of course, historically have never experienced whiteness to the extent that whiteness is power and privilege in a society. But so embedded in the idea that Zionism is racism is the idea that white people, quote unquote, the Jews, these white people, came and colonized the brown people of the Middle East, the indigenous brown people of the Middle East. The assumptions are baked in that Jews are not originally from this land, that Jews are white, that the people who are from this land are brown, that the Jews must be colonizers who came to take over, to dominate, to oppress the indigenous people here. And once that becomes embedded in the framework, it is impossible to extricate. And so many of the people who hear this idea that Zionism is racism, they have images in their head that they're not confronting because they don't even know how they got there. They perceive Jews as white. If they've met a Jew, they may have been white. People don't realize actually that the majority of Jews in Israel are not white. 60% of Israeli Jews are from the Middle East and North Africa. 20% of Israeli society is Arab. And that even the Jews who look white, and, in America, a lot of Jews who came from Europe after the Holocaust or before the Holocaust, hopefully, do look white and in many ways do experience whiteness, but also are threatened and have been targeted as being non-white, that we were almost exterminated because we were impure, because we were, vermin, that we were undermining whiteness by existing in German and in European society. So a lot of ideas are baked into this idea that Jews are white colonizers, that Zionism is therefore racism, that it's that it's a supremacy, Jewish supremacy, the idea that there could be a state by and for the Jewish people. But what I would remind the listener is that the vast majority of countries in the world have ethnic and or religious majorities. America is strange in the sense that, I mean, we do, of course, have an ethnic and religious majority in white Christians, but that we believe so deeply in pluralism and invest so much in pluralism. Most countries in the world don't have that. Most countries have religious and ethnic majorities, and Israel also has a religious and ethnic majority in the Jewish people, but of course is an incredibly diverse country that is not only made up of Jews.
And we can talk a little bit more about sort of what it is to try to live with that majority. But I think one of the things that I always think about is the way in which people have a worldview they construct based on whatever is sort of the current zeitgeist, the current way of looking at the world, and they want to lay that on the Middle East, and they want to lay that on the Jewish people, and we just don't fit that. So when you come from like a Western background, you look at religion through the lens of Christianity and Islam, which is an ideology that transcends nationality. Christianity as a Western tradition is an ideology that is not fundamentally based on a national identity. It's a worldview. It's a religious identity. And because Jews lived in Europe, and because Jews lived in and amongst Christendom, there was this idea that, well, I guess Judaism is also like that. And in many ways, I think as Judaism modernized, they kind of wanted to be like that too. So when you read some of the early writings of the reformers, they talk about how they're not praying about going back to Jerusalem. They're looking at New York as the New Jerusalem. And they tried their best to try to shed some of those national identities. And one of the things that they kind of realized at the beginning of the 20th century and throughout the 20th century is even if we wanted to shed those national identities, we can't. And I think one of the things that also happened was that there was sort of a swinging of the pendulum through the 20th century of Jews who said, you know what? Not only can't we shed our national identity, we don't have to, and we shouldn't have to. We can be very proud American Jews while also celebrating our national roots and our identity in the same way that an American from France can celebrate their French identity, in the same way that an American from Italy can celebrate their Italian identity. And those two things don't necessarily have to be divided. I remember growing up in our home, we were liberals. And it wasn't like my parents sat us down and said, okay, children, we're liberals. But I just remember it was just cooked into the way that we were raised to believe in certain ideas. I remember as a little boy, I was in the kitchen, and I don't even think my mom knew I was there. And my mom and dad were talking about something, and I heard her say, why do they care about the color of that man's skin? That's not what matters. It's who you are on the inside that matters. And I'm like, oh, okay. And, they didn't sort of sit me down and say, okay, Dan, we don't believe in looking at people through the lens of race, but through the idea of growing up in suburban Washington, in a time when the idea that you shouldn't care about race was still kind of new, there was this value imposition that my parents kind of raised us with that had to do with caring for the underdog, and it had to do with not judging people by externalities. It had to do with, I had a mother who was helping women get back into the workforce, who herself was in the workforce, and to not look at women differently than men in terms of their capacities to perform in the professional sphere. All of these ways in which we kind of were inculcated by osmosis and maybe some sense deliberately, these sort of values that animated us as progressive people. And growing up, Israel was just a part of that same progressiveness. And we were taught to love Israel because of all of the things that the Declaration of Independence said it was, and about all of the ways that Israel was trying to build a society that was based on these same ideas of justice and goodness. And what happens is, I think we have tried our best to, in the way I was raised to love Israel in this way, to raise our kids this way too. But as there has been a growing consciousness over the intricacies of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you have a lot of young people who said, "Why did you lie to me? Why didn't you tell me the whole story about the very painful, difficult decisions and events that took place during the birth of the State of Israel and in other times over its course of its history?" So as someone who is advancing Zionism as part of your movement, what did it do to you as someone who also embraces those same progressive values when you learned about the intricacies of what happened at Israel's birth and the intricacies of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
Wow, there's so much here. Well, okay. Let me start by saying that the vast majority of Jews in the world are small L liberals, because that's how we exist. That's how we are alive, because we believe in protecting minority communities. We are one. We are 2% of the population of America and 0.2%, 1/5 of 1% of the population of the world. We don't survive in countries where minorities are not protected. We don't survive in countries where there isn't, freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom to be different, because we are different. We are by definition different. We've been targeted for being different in every society under every political and economic system in the history of the world. So Jews need liberalism. We only function and thrive in societies where liberalism is the dominant political force. And that's not about political parties in America. I mean, liberalism as an idea. The idea that what happened, quote unquote, what happened at Israel's founding, and I know I don't mean to say that in a way that's negative toward you. I mean, that perception that something happened during Israel's founding. And I always, I don't even really use the word founding. I say the reestablishment of the Jewish state for the third time, that a Jewish independent polity would exist in the land of Israel, happened in 1948. And there was a war for Israel's sovereignty. There are actually two wars for Israel's sovereignty. First, the decolonial movement to remove the imperial British forces who had, were oppressing the indigenous people in that land and had colonized that land. So the Jews returned home and expelled the British imperial forces in a decolonial victory. And then the reestablishment of Jewish sovereignty in our indigenous homeland, which to me is the most successful decolonial movement in human history, is the modern political Zionist movement. The movement for the Jewish people to reclaim sovereignty in our homeland is the opposite of colonialism. So the war waged against the reborn Jewish state in 1948 by 5 of Israel's Arab neighbors was devastating for everyone involved. And you're not going to hear me say anything good about there having been a war. There didn't need to be a war. Now, you and I know that the Arabs rejected the partition plan, that the Jews accepted the partition plan, that everybody could have lived side by side in peace in 2 states starting in 1947, and nothing that has happened in the 77 years since then needed to happen. We know that. I don't actually think that argument moves anybody who doesn't know that. So I often joke that we are not going to win this fight in the progressive movement or in the world broadly for Zionism by helping people understand the history of the Balfour Declaration or of the partition plan. Nobody cares. And the way that they invoke these ideas like colonialism and imperialism and racism, they're exclusive to Israel. They don't use language like this about the founding of any other state. And I often joke to audiences that I speak to, I say, raise your hand if you can name one state that was founded, that is a member of the UN, 193 nation states that are members of the United Nations, the Community of Nations. I ask people if they can name one whose borders were not drawn in blood. Is there any state that exists on Earth that did not come about as a result of war, strife, interethnic conflict, violence? There are none. There are none. Colonization, by the way, all over the world. And that's not an excuse. I'm not saying it as a good thing. I'm saying that there was a war for Israel's establishment, as there was for the establishment of every other country that we recognize. And that's not a good thing. And I wish we didn't have wars. But this is the only war for the establishment of a country that continues 77 years later, where the people who began waging the war the day the country was established have not stopped waging that war, have not said, we accept the existence of this country, now let's move on and think about how to build our own state or to make the states that we live in, all of the surrounding states, to make them function properly for the betterment of the people who live there.
I recently had a chance to learn with an Israeli scholar named Einat Wolf, who herself sort of cut her teeth in progressive movements in Israel. And she said that the one thing that's so interesting about Israel's Arab neighbors and the Palestinians is that they have been very, very consistent from the very beginning in what they've believed, which is they don't believe there should be a Jewish state. And they don't believe that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. And they have worked since long before the establishment of the modern state of Israel to ensure that there wouldn't be a Jewish homeland in that place, to deny Jews the ability to reestablish their sovereignty in the land that is their indigenous home. And they've been remarkably consistent all the way along, whether it's through all of the wars that Israel fought with Arab neighbors or in all of the different permutations of agreements or lack thereof with Palestinians. It's always been this idea of not about living alongside you, it's about living instead of you. And you still hear that, by the way, in the Palestinian streets, whether it's in Gaza or in parts of the West Bank, Judea, Samaria. So this idea of whether the Jewish people should be allowed to have its own state, whether the Jews have a right to their own self-determination, is something that has never been accepted by the vast majority of Israel's neighbors or even some of the people who live within the boundaries of the state of Israel or in the territories that Israel has over time and at different times had to occupy. So when we think about this natural right that we all believe in for people to have self-determination and Zionism, and then you see that Israel has at times made very difficult decisions. One of the things I always think about is Ari Shavit's book, My Promised Land, and he talks about the very complicated history of the city of Lud, which was an Arab village. And then during Israel's war, which it didn't ask for or start, you have one airport in Israel, and you have a city that's on the end of the runway. And Ben-Gurion has to decide, are we going to allow for an antagonistic enemy to live in a village at the end of the one runway that we have at the one airport there is in this country? And the answer was no, we can't. And so they had to expel the residents of this city, who had to endure all of the horrors that our people knows better than anyone of what it's like to be made to be tossed out of your home and be forced into exile away from where you used to be. And at the same time, we also know that this rejectionism that we get has also led to a lot of the internal struggles. So how does somebody who comes from a progressive ideology, who believes in freedom, believes in justice, take a look at some of the challenges in the way that Israel has had to deal with its Palestinian neighbors and still hold on to those same principles while at the same time also believing in Israel's right to defend itself and to secure itself? How do you, as someone, balance those two things in your heart?
So this is a great question that I think a lot of people struggle with. What I will say is our work at Zioness and my focus as Amanda is on domestic social justice causes, and making sure that there is a space here in America for me and people like me to fight for reproductive freedom and racial justice and equity and, and climate justice and gun violence prevention and LGBTQ equality and all of these issues that affect our lives and our bodies here in America, where we live and vote and work and have impact on the political system. Our work is about making sure that people who care about social justice in America are not expelling Jews from their movements and using the word Zionist instead of the word Jew to excuse the way that Jews are treated in these spaces. And the argument is twofold. First of all, you can't call yourself a progressive if you are expelling Jews from anywhere. You can't. That is not a progressive movement. It is not a progressive value to say Jews are not welcome here. You can't substitute the word Zionist and tell yourself it's progressive and tell yourself that these people are white colonizers and oppressors. That is the perpetuation of age-old anti-Semitic tropes. The progressive movement in America will continue to fail at advancing the issues, values, and causes that I need to be safe and free in America as a Jewish woman and as a human being. And we talk a lot in our community about our history of advocacy, activism, and in particular, allyship. We talk a lot about the allyship and the commitment to standing with other marginalized communities. And I'm really proud of that history and that legacy of our community. And I want us to continue it, not just to point backward at what we've done in the past and what, we're proud that our parents and grandparents did, but I want us to be participating in all of that work today. And I don't want to cede those spaces to the bigotry of anti-Zionism. But beyond that, when I show up in women's rights spaces in America, I'm not doing it as an ally. When my Black Jewish friends show up in racial justice spaces, they're not doing it as allies. When my LGBTQ Jewish friends show up in LGBTQ spaces and are targeted as Zionists, they are not there as allies to LGBTQ movements. They are people who need these movements to succeed in order to have their rights and freedoms protected in this country. And they are being targeted as Zionists in spaces that they personally need to be involved in to protect their lives and their bodies. This idea that we have to pick one part of ourselves as Jews, we can either be Jews and Zionists, or we can be women or Black Americans or LGBTQ people, right? That we have to extricate our Jewish identity and our Zionism in order to be welcome in spaces that matter so deeply to us here. That's the problem that I'm most focused on when it comes to my progressive identity. It's as an American. Of course I struggle with what goes on in Israel, the same way I struggle with what goes on here. And I have a lot to say. And to the extent that I follow the intricacies of the different, military things that are going on in Israel, I have opinions. But I don't vote there. I don't speak Hebrew. I pay attention from here, from afar, really concerned, both the threats externally and the threats internally to Israeli society. As a progressive, I care deeply about supporting and working with and amplifying the voices of progressive Israelis. Over the last, before October 7th, the whole year before October 7th, there were massive protests every single week against a judicial overhaul that was going to threaten, and continues, I think, to be a threat to minority communities in Israel, including women, including secular Israelis, including Arab Israelis, including LGBTQ Israelis. And 20% of Israeli society showed up to protest their government every week for a year. It would be akin to 70 million Americans that were showing up every week to protest our government, to the extent that our government was trying to take away people's rights. So to me, Israeli society has become a model for how to build thriving progressive movements that hold authority to account. And I want us to follow their lead. And I hope that those progressive movements in Israel continue to grow and build. And I hope that they succeed in revitalizing what I see as Israel's, progressive value. And the very last thing I want to say about that is that these progressive leaders in Israel who were standing up for their rights and their values in Israel were doing that work as Zionists. It was in the name of their Zionism that they want to protect Israeli democracy. And so that, to me, is the best way to explain the relationship between Zionism and progressive values.
And I think that is the same irrespective of whether you're a patriotic American or a patriotic Zionist. I think when I think about what animates me and my love for America, it's not always for what America has chosen to do in the course of its history. It's about the vision of what America says is the best version of itself. A government of the people, by the people, for the people, a place that does not discriminate on the basis of race or gender or sexuality or religion, where I can pray how I want, I can say what I want, I can print what I want, I can gather with the people that I want, where this is supposed to be the land of opportunity, a place, right, where we hold these truths to be self-evident that all are created equal. And that's the America I love. And so when I think about the causes in America that I fight for, whether it's women's rights or LGBT rights or any of the other social causes that animate me as an American, it comes from that vision of what I think America is supposed to be. Now, America has done some terrible things in the course of its history that I look back with utter moral revulsion. The idea that we used to think about a person of color as being 3/5 of a person of white hue, or the idea that we would root gay people out of the military, or that they had to worry and look over their shoulder when they decided that they wanted to go out for a drink with someone that they might fall in love with. All of the different things that we used to do in America, I look back with shame and with embarrassment, but I don't question the project of America in doing so. And at the same time, I can, as someone who loves the land and the people and the state of Israel, I can look back at certain things that different governments of Israel have chosen to do and look back and say, "Oy gewalt, how could we ever have done such a thing?" Or even just looking at the way that things happen in Israel today, I can look at that also with the same moral revulsion and say, we can't allow that to happen. But that doesn't make me question the validity of the enterprise. I push for Israel to be the best expression of itself in the same way that I try to push for America to be the best expression of itself. And I love the work that you do by saying to Jewish people, you shouldn't have to check your identity at the door to fight for the America you want. And that people who want to call themselves progressives can't ask for the persecution or the closeting of certain people in order for them to be part of their movement. And I think you're right. I think it really has hurt the success of those endeavors by virtue of the narrow-mindedness that they approach and the way that they want to lay ideas like colonialism and others onto a conflict that doesn't really square that way. So when you think about since October the 7th, and you think about the ways in which Zionist writers who may or may not be Zionist, but who have Jewish identity are thrown out of literary conventions, or anybody who has dared ever write something that was favorable toward the state of Israel are targeted for cancellation, what is the best way that we can counter that trend so that we not only just restore our capacity to participate in the causes that we care about, but to make a better America and perhaps a stronger connection and stronger Zionism too? What do you think are the best things that we each can do to advance that?
Well, I think that we have to fight back to the idea that there is something inherently negative with being a Zionist, because to me, being a Zionist, as I've already said, is intrinsic to my Jewish identity. It's the core component of my Jewish identity. It is the liberation movement of the Jewish people. Therefore, it is a progressive value. It's about, self-determination for a persecuted minority people. That's what progressives care about. That's what we fight for as progressives. I also think that helping people understand that this litmus test issue harms the left, harms the movements, harms our values, that when we are kicking out committed activists from progressive movements, the movements will fail. And there are so many examples of this, from the British Labour Party to the Canadian Green Party to movements like the Women's March and Black Lives Matter. When people have adopted ideas about Jews and internalized ideas about Jews in the movements fall apart. And we lose our ability to fight for, any of the issues that we care about in the left. So first of all, I believe in using the word Zionist very proudly. I also believe in using the word progressive very proudly. And I know that word also, triggers a lot of people right now for a lot of really good reason. There are people who call themselves progressive who perpetuate incredibly dangerous, incredibly anti-progressive ideas. There are people who call themselves progressive who champion or excuse October 7th, who champion or excuse kidnapping and rape and torture and murdering children and burning babies alive tied to their parents. There are people who excuse that in the name of progressivism. So I understand why there are a lot of people who say, I don't want anything to do with the progressive movement. I don't want anything to do with the word progressive. But I think we need to fight back and reclaim these words because words have meaning. Zionism is who we are as Jews. And I say this all the time. If we can't call ourselves Zionists today, we will not be able to call ourselves Jews tomorrow. The same way that when I founded Zioness in 2017, a lot of people did not want to raise their hand as Zionists, even though they were Zionists and they knew what Zionism was and they felt, proud of who they are as Jews, but didn't want to raise their hand publicly as Zionists. Now a lot of people don't want to raise their hands as Jews. Now a lot of people are afraid when they walk into a room to be identified as Jews. People, who don't wear a Magen David or who, feel that they have to wear a baseball cap instead of a yarmulke, because that is how quickly this virus has mutated and taken over parts of our society. And so I want us to fight back because I really believe that most people don't understand what's going on. I believe that most people in the progressive movement and in the left more broadly don't know what Zionism is and what it means to us. And they are being influenced by campaigns that have been waged since 1975, since the Soviet Union started this propaganda campaign calling Zionism racism. So first of all, I think we have to take people in good faith until they show us that, we can't. I think we need to assume that most people are ignorant and not evil and don't have, bad intent, even if they have absorbed anti-Semitic ideas. I don't want to call them anti-Semites. I want to help them understand why those ideas are problematic and harmful and inconsistent with progressive values. And I want us to show up as loudly and proudly as we can as Jews and Zionists, because courage and confidence is contagious. When you show up as a Zionist, it gives someone else a permission structure to do the same thing. It gives them language and an understanding of the fact that Zionism is something that we should be proud of, that it is an utter miracle that this tiny minority community that has been, kicked out of everywhere, experienced every kind of oppression and persecution and dimitude and genocide, forced assimilation, forced conversion, all of it over thousands of years, that we could come home and reclaim our sovereignty in our indigenous homeland, that we could rebuild that state, that we could, reinstate that language, that all of the things that the Jewish people have been able to do, I think can be a model. And Theodor Herzl wanted Zionism to be that. He wanted it to be a model for liberation for everyone. And, it's unfortunate. It breaks my heart that we, the Jewish nation who fought the the battle for Zion, for the reestablishment of the Jewish state and contemporary Zionism, that we haven't been able to say, okay, that part's done. Now we can focus on fighting for liberation, for other minority communities. We've not been able to take our eye off this ball yet, 77 years later. So I want us to be able to, to finish that fight, for the world to say Israel exists, Israel is safe, it's not going anywhere. The Jewish nation stands, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people live. And also we have so much other work to do, and we're not going to be able to achieve it if we are kicking Jews and Zionists out of our spaces or kicking anyone out of our spaces. We need to be united and inclusive in the progressive movement, and we need to apply progressive values to every community, which means allowing the Jewish people to define our liberation as Zionism.
Amanda, thanks so much for being with us today. And in the same way that I think the pride that I have as an American comes from the American ideal that I strive for, my pride as a Zionist comes from my pride in Israel, what it's achieved and what its promise is of what it can achieve. And I think that if we can fight for those principles that have animated the Jewish people for thousands of years, which animate me as an American, as a Zionist, as a Jew, the world will be a better place. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Rabbi.
The Essential Questions podcast has been made possible by the Temple Beth El Jewish Ideas Incubator, committed to creativity and innovation in modern Jewish life. Many thanks to our production team. You can find this podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, and the Podbean app, as well as on Temple Beth El's website, tbeboca.org/essential questions. Share this podcast with your friends, rate us on Apple Podcast or Spotify to spread the word. And we want to know, what are your essential questions? Let us know by emailing us at eq@tbeboca.org. I'm Rabbi Dan Levin, and thanks for listening to the Essential Questions podcast.